The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them.
There are times when your workpiece size is such that it's not easily machined at the router table or by using a straight edge clamp on the workpiece to help guide a router. Now this would apply to situations where you're routing a dado or a groove on a workpiece that's relatively small in size, very difficult to hold or manipulate. This particular jig is one of those solutions that you're probably going to want to build. It's going to help you out a lot in our other story in this issue about making a clock. Now we've incorporated a number of very nice features into it to add some flexibility so that you can use it for more than just one or two sized workpieces. And we'll bring you in a little closer and show you some of those features before we start building it. Now one of the first features I'd like to talk about is its function. This tool guide automatically creates a nice square cut relative to our fence. Now the fence is only standing proud of our clamping surface by 3/16 of an inch, so we can work all the way down to a 1/4 inch thick stock, or even less for that matter. Now the adjustable tool guide slides up and down to accommodate the different thicknesses of material that you're cutting. Here we've got 1/4 inch material. We'll slide this up. And here we've got 3/4 inch thick stock. So as you can see, we can accommodate the different thicknesses of work. The width of this particular jig is 7 3/8. Of course, you could modify that to any width to suit your needs. Its overall length accommodates most of the workpieces that would fit in this range, and it's open on both ends so your workpieces can extend out. We've incorporated aluminum T-track so that you can use the wide variety of clamping accessories that are available to make clamping the workpiece to the jig very easy. We've also incorporated a cleat on the bottom so that you can hook it over the end of your workbench and treat it like a bench hook, or clamp it up in your workbench vise. Now the construction of this is actually very simple. There's only one real critical step, and that's to make sure that your tool guide is square to your fence, and you will want a nice precision square to use during that step. So let's jump right in and start making the jig. Constructing the jig starts out with a few very basic components, mostly 3/4 inch birch plywood. There will be a base plate, and in my case it's 1/2 inch birch. Just happens to be a scrap that I had laying around just about the perfect size. Next we'll have our sub base, and that would fit on top of there. Then we'll have our back guide and our front guide, and then our fence for which the router is going to slide against. Now I just started out by ripping and cross-cutting all these pieces to their appropriate size. Now to help with clamping our workpieces and so forth, I'm going to be using this extruded aluminum T-track material. And I picked up a length of it that's about 48 inches long. So what I'm going to do is put in 2 of these. And that will give me many more options available for clamping my workpieces. Now I want these to be in about 2 inches from each edge of our sub base. Now the dado that we need to machine, or rather the groove that we need to machine, has to be a 1/2 inch deep by 3/4 of an inch wide. To machine that, let's head over to the table saw. Now I've got my 3/4 inch stacked dado head cutter in the table saw. It's raised up a 1/2 of an inch. I also set my rip fence at a 2 inch distance. Now I'll pass it over one way, flip it around, pass it through the second way for our 2 grooves. And we'll make sure that our T-track fits in there nice and flush and that it doesn't stand proud at all. Well, that's a good fit. Now what we need to do is cut off this T-track to its same length as our jig. So I'll just take a pencil, mark the length, and cut it with a hacksaw. Using a file, I'll go ahead and deburr the edges. Now right now our jig is actually almost functional, but let's add a little bit of flexibility to it. Now if we were working with 3/4 inch thick stock, our router would pass by our front and back fences because they're at 3/4 inch high. However, if you're going to be doing some dadoing on narrower stock, the fence is in the way of allowing the router to travel forward and backwards. So what we need to do, in the area where we'll be routing, we need to drop this fence area down so that it only stands proud of our base by about 3/16 inch, maybe even as much as 1/4 inch. And we'll do that operation over at the bandsaw. Now I'll start out by making my stop cuts. Now to help with making this a nice straight cut, I've clamped on a straight edge, and that will help guide the workpiece as we make this ripping operation. Now you'll notice that I made the stop cut first, and that allowed me to just feed in and back out a small distance. If I were to make my long rip cut first, I'd have had to pull this all the way back out, and that can pull the blade off of the guides. And here you can see how now our front and rear fences are down below the top surface of our workpiece, so that allows the router to glide nice and freely over even the thinnest of materials. At this point we're ready for some assembly, and it'll start out by attaching the base and the sub base together along with one of the fences. I'll be using glue and brads to hold everything together. Now I'll get glue on the sub base and along the front fence rail. Now what I'm doing is making sure that my sub base is tight up against my front fence rail. My fence rail is flush at the left and right ends, and that I'm flush with the outer portion of my main base. Now with these 3 pieces lined up, I'm going to drive some brads down through these grooves to help hold the 2 pieces together. Now switching to my other nailer, I'm going to use some 1 1/8" brads to hold our front fence rail to our sub base and to our base. Now this next step is fairly critical. I'm just going to loosely place the back fence in position. The router guide bar I'm going to place on top of those 2 pieces, and there's a couple areas that we've got to be very careful with when we attach this. Now we have to make sure that our guide bar is either perfectly flush or at least a little bit proud of that notch that we cut down here. We also have to make sure that we are perfectly square when we attach these 2 pieces together. Use the best square that you can to do this operation. Now if you don't have a good precision machinist square, I highly recommend that you pick one up. Remember that the square that you use is going to establish the squareness of everything you build after this. So if you've got a crummy, cheap little square that you picked up at the local department store, you may not be building things very square. So I do recommend that you have one very good, very precise square as a foundation for everything that you build with. So with those parameters defined, we can go ahead and attach this piece now. We'll be using glue and brads to hold this in place. Now my first area of concern is to make sure that we're either flush or proud. If we're not, well, we got a little bit more work to do. We look good there, good and square, and we're flush there. Now what I'll do is I'll drive in a brad. Now again, I'm going to recheck everything before I drive in the second brad, because right now it's allowed to pivot on that one brad. And again, I'll check it to make sure it didn't move on me. And we're in great shape. Now what I'm going to do is let this glue set up a little bit before attaching the other end. Now what I'm doing is going through and marking the hole locations to attach our aluminum T-track. Using a scratch awl, create a starter dimple, and then a 5/64" drill bit to create the pilot holes. And the T-track material gets held in place with number 6 by 1/2" wood screws. Now I can spin the jig around and attach the other fence. Again, glue and brads. Get some glue underneath our guide bar. Now what we have to do is very carefully line this fence up so that it's flush at the front edge here, and then double check to make sure that our guide bar is square to our fences. And we're good and square. Now what I'll do is I'll tack my fence to my sub base with 1¼ inch brads. Now I'll drive some brads through the base into our fence, looking for any glue squeeze out and deal with that. And then again, we'll check to make sure that we're good and square. Now with everything checking out, we'll tack this end with a couple of more 1¼ brads. And again, we'll let the glue cure up before moving on. Now you're probably already getting a real good idea how this jig is going to work. You'd load your workpiece in, and this just happens to be a 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood. Place your router on there and cut across in this fashion. However, there's one problem we need to overcome. When routing thin stock, you'll notice that even my small router would slide right underneath my guide bar. The larger router would even have a similar problem wherein we might be guiding across this rough casting. To account for the various thicknesses of material that we'd be using on this jig, we've come up with a very, very simple little solution. And it's an adjustable tool guide. It slides up and down to accommodate the different thicknesses of material. You could use any material that you wanted, but of course you want something that's straight, flat, and true. Now what we need to do is start out by cutting a piece off that's about 2 inches longer than our jig is wide. And we want to rip it very, very carefully so that it is just a shave wider than this component right here. So we'll head over to the table saw and the compound miter saw and begin cutting up the pieces for the adjustable tool guide. And that is a perfect fit. Now we can go ahead and assemble our adjustable guide. Just be very sparing with the glue. And we'll just bring the front and back pieces on, very carefully lining up the ends. Throw a clamp on here to help hold it together. And I'm going to use some pin nails. Now, of course, if you don't have a pin nailer, you can just clamp it and wait for the glue to dry. Now I'll go through, wipe off any glue squeeze out on these inside corners. And now we can get a little glue on our end caps. Tack those in place with a couple of pin nails. Oh, and that fits on there just beautiful. You can even hear the air rushing out as it slides down. Now, because it's fitting on there nice and tight, I do want to make one last check to make sure that this box, our adjustable tool guide, is in fact square to our fences. We're very good that way, and I'll check it against this side, and we're right on the money. Now, if for some reason this wasn't flat or straight or square, I'd have to very carefully sand away the high spots until everything is flat and square. Now let's add one last feature to our jig. Now when you're using a jig like this, as you're feeding along, it's very easy for the jig to slide along on your workbench. So let's add a bench hook. And that's nothing more than a cleat that will attach to the undersurface of our jig that we can either clamp in our bench vise or just hook around the front of the workbench. And we'll just attach that cleat with some glue and brads. And that'll work out fine. If I want it a little more secure, I can slide it over my bench vise And now I don't have to worry about the jig moving during my cutting operations. Now with the construction complete on the jig, let's take a moment to talk about how we can use it and how we can clamp workpieces to it while we're doing the machining operations. The test drive for our jig is going to be a component for a clock that we're making elsewhere in this issue of the magazine. Now here you can see we've got a dovetail slot in this end, and I also need one in this end. Now of course, I couldn't put on a clamp-on straight edge guide because there's nothing out here to support that. And that's why this jig is so handy. Now of course, we've got our adjustable tool guide, and we have to reference off of that surface to set our cut position. I've got a layout mark on my workpiece, so I'll just slide the workpiece up until I line up that layout mark. Now of course, that will vary depending on your router. Now in this case, I've got exactly 1 inch, 672 thousandths of an inch from the edge of my router base to the center line of the bit. And of course, each router is different. You get into the larger plunge routers, and it's a greater distance between the edge and the center of your bit. Now the jig will work with any size router for that matter. So once you get your position set, now we have to concern ourselves with clamping our work to the jig. And luckily, the manufacturers that are coming up with this extruded aluminum T-track material are also addressing a wide variety of clamping options. This just happens to be a nice fancy clamp that I picked up when I picked up the aluminum T-track. And that just simply slides in the T-track and tighten up the knob. And now that work is very securely held in place so we can perform our routing operation. Now with my router bit depth set accordingly, we can go ahead and make the cut. Boy, that made that operation very simple to do. Of course, my slot is nice and parallel to that tool guide, which is also square to the edge, so I know everything lines up perfectly. Now this is a real handy jig to have in your shop. It has a good working range, different thicknesses of material, different widths of material, good clamping options, and of course an easy jig clamping option as well. So if you don't have a jig like this, now is probably the time to do it because you'll be able to get plenty of use out of it with your clock project. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.